Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to give a warm welcome to all of you sitting in the Hong Kong Theatre this morning, as well as everyone watching us online from different parts of the world. My name is Dimitra Stratopoulou, and I have the honor to kick off the 8th LSESU Hellenic Society conference. Now, this is the third Hellenic conference I'm organizing, and to be frank, this has been the most challenging. Before the pandemic, a hybrid event would have seemed a bit unusual, to say the least. Now, of course, we're long grown quite accustomed to engaging in virtual realities and virtual debates with individuals thousands of kilometers away. Today, our purpose is to focus on Greece's future, overcoming the disturbances and difficulties of the previous years. More specifically, through the conference, we would like to project the hopeful message that we can redefine the future of our country through innovation and sustainable development. This year's conference is a continuation of last year's event, in which we reflected and examined the course of our country 200 years after our national revolution. This year, based on last year's conclusions, we're looking forward with hope and disposition for change. The event hopes to carry an anatomy of the Greek reality, as it will examine the country's current state and future plans through a variety of lenses. You will have the chance to listen to and take part in discussions centered around politics, international relations, economics, innovation, culture, and society. We strongly believe that individual speeches and parallel monologues will not be sufficient to examine such complicated issues. Therefore, we aim to host fruitful dialogues, which allow speakers to not only challenge each other's views, but also to collectively develop substantiated and well-grounded ideas. Distinguished speakers will deliver opening remarks at the start of each panel, aiming to set the scene for the upcoming debates. Across our panels, there will be a discussion around the central topics among the speakers with the help of the panel moderators. Then the floor will be yours to ask questions. Now, of course, some of you may wonder, what does actually the title of our conference mean? So let me help you. Semper stands for always. Ad stands for towards, and Meliora stands for better. Therefore, Semper Ad Meliora is Latin for always towards better. Now, our title is as simple, yet as complicated as a wish. We express a strong desire and hope for Greece's constant development, but we know this is something hard to accomplish. This is why, through today's discussions, we aim to investigate the means that can contribute towards achieving better fiscal, economic, and social outcomes, but at the same time, to identify any potential growth impediments. Before I yield the floor to our first speaker, I would like to thank everyone who's helped give life to our conference. Firstly, the LSE Students Union and our event coordinator, Hannah Finney, for their organizational support all these months. Secondly, all LSE staff, catering, IT technicians, and security for assisting us today. Thirdly, of course, our communication supporters, the Kathimarini newspaper and Capital.gr for all their promotion. Nonetheless, this conference would not have been a reality without the strong commitment and hard work of the Hellenic Society board members. There are no words to describe how grateful I am for having them by my side. Thank you, guys. I sincerely hope that today's event will be delightful and intellectually stimulating. Thank you. So now we will proceed with the first panel, which is on politics and international relations. And the opening remarks will be delivered by the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Nikos Dendias.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm particularly happy as this is the second consecutive time that I have the pleasure to address your conference. As a graduate of LSE myself, I believe that the initiatives you undertake contribute to a better understanding on the part of the academic community of issues of Greek interest. In addition, you serve as a bridge of interaction and strengthening relations between young scientists from the United Kingdom and Greece. I congratulate you on your highly successful contribution. It has been almost 12 months since I last had the pleasure of addressing you. Greece and the international community continue to face more or less the same challenges, albeit with varying intensity on several occasions, as for instance the need to address the pandemic and its complex consequences, the effort for a gradual return to economic normality, the exploration of ways to combat climate change, the resurgence of tensions and the emergence of sources of possible armed conflicts. In this climate of uncertainty and constant change, Greek foreign policy did not remain inactive, just a mere observer of developments. It expanded its scope for action and further strengthened its alliances and partnerships, both in the immediate neighborhood, in Europe, the Middle East, and the Balkans, as in the rest of the world, building relations with new partners in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, always on the basis of fundamental principles such as international law and especially the law of the sea, promoting simultaneously the principles of the United Nations Charter, beginning with the prohibition of the threat or use of force. Unfortunately, however, a country in our immediate neighborhood continues to ignore these fundamental rules. Nevertheless, Greece, despite the immediate challenges it faces, will continue to play its stabilizing role and constitute a factor of security, a credible ally and partner, implementing a foreign policy always based on the principles of international law. To this extent, we are also promoting our candidacy for the United Nations Security Council for the 25-26 term, and everyone's contribution to this effort is most welcome. I hope that next time conditions will give us the opportunity to exchange our views in person. I wish you every success.
We can now proceed to a first panel.
Welcome, everyone. I'm Stathis Kalyvas, and I have accepted to moderate this first panel. And so I'd like to, first of all, introduce the speakers and say a couple of things about the ground rules for that panel. I'm very happy to have three distinguished guests. And I will start with Mariana Skylakaki, who is a journalist who has studied in Bristol initially, and then continued her studies at the LSE, worked in London, and is very well known to many people who follow the news bulletin every day on their inbox, Athenea, which is always informative and thought-provoking. Welcome, Mariana. The second guest is Dimitrios Troikos, who is a fellow at the LSE, at the Department of International Relations, with two areas I was going to be tempted to say overlapping, but perhaps not so overlapping specialties, China on the one hand and Asia, and on the other hand, outer space. And finally, Mr. Apostolos Kostas, joining us, I understand, from Thessaloniki, who is a politician with the New Democracy Party, who has studied in Georgetown and UCL, and Northern Greece and Macedonia, and also from 2020 is the president of the European Committee of the Regions. We are going to talk today about politics and international relations, which is a very big and open area with a lot of interesting things going on right now. And I would like to ask you either not to say anything as a way of introduction, the objective being to have a conversation as we would have it in any other setting. And if you decide to do so, I think Dimitrios wanted to present something, not to exceed 5 minutes. So Dimitrios wanted to share some slides with us. And so let's start with him, and then I'll be asking each of you if you would like to say something. Otherwise, I'll start bombarding you with questions and we can take it from there.
Yes, can you hear me well?
Yes.
Great. Hi, everyone. So I don't have to share any slides, given the instructions you sent us earlier. So let's have a discussion. Okay. Okay.
So let me start then with a general question from each of you. And I'm going to start asking you following alphabetical order, and then we'll reverse it. But obviously, the biggest thing happening right now in the world, perhaps, is the situation as it is evolving in the border between Russia and the Ukraine. And so I want to ask you, what's your take on it? How do you see this developing? And finally, how do you think that is going to affect Greece? So starting perhaps with Mariana.
Okay, thank you. First of all, thank you so much for the invitation, and it's a pleasure to be back at the LSE in some way today and to be having this discussion. It really was. I mean, I was trying to make some notes about the key things that we should perhaps talk about in this event today, and obviously the situation in Ukraine is in everybody's mind because. I was just yesterday reading this article by historian Yuval Noah Harari, who was saying that what's happening in the Ukraine is going to be important for the future of humanity itself. Well, that might sound a bit far-fetched to some, but I think what he was getting at was that this idea of the implausibility of war that we've perhaps grown accustomed to in certain Western parts of the world over the past decades seems to be, eroding as a concept, and that's a big deal. That's very, very important. At the same time, though, what I wanted to point out was the fact that what's happening in the Ukraine is not something new. And why I'm saying that is because we've had a lot of threats over the past decade or so that we've encountered, and a lot of crises, and a lot of them are truly, truly novel in the way that they present themselves. An aggressor, a country, a leader that's perhaps also a little bit desperate in the situation that he's created for himself, trying to attack a country or have the upper hand in a certain situation, is something that we've seen again and again and again in the history of mankind, even in modern history. For example, what Putin, on the contrary, what Putin did and what Russia did back in 2016 by perhaps helping elect Donald Trump in the US was a far more insidious way of waging warfare or of trying to, change the course of things than attacking a country. So I just wanted to point out this difference between attacking in a way that we would have seen, 100 years ago and attacking in the way that we know is possible today. And I think this interaction between things that we know and the new tools and realities of technology is at the core of what we should be discussing and the future of mankind, but also of international relations, obviously, and politics, both in Greece, but also, with Greece as a player in the international arena.
Thank you very much, Marianne. I will just note, being myself a student of conflict, that the phenomenon of the War of Territorial Conquest is indeed antiquated. I cannot find a better word to describe it. And this is puzzling in an era in which we've been told there are new forms of violent interaction between states, from cyber warfare, from hybrid warfare. This particular form, which is a very 19th century type war of territorial conquest, appears to be completely outside the realm of the imaginable even. And I think that raises a very interesting question. Why is it that we observe it? I'm going to turn to Dimitris next and ask you, when we talk about security issues on a global scale, and of course, everything that happens on a global scale has an impact on Greece as well, everyone had in mind the situation between the United States and China. No one really took the situation in Russia as seriously, and perhaps in spite of what is going on today, most people know that this is probably a sideshow. Certainly for the United States, all their attention is focused on China. They are much less interested, perhaps, in what is going on with Russia. So can you help us make sense of this contradiction? Why are things happening where they shouldn't be based on what we know and what we expect?
Yes, that's a great question. Well, it's obviously very difficult to make sense of what's going on. I think there's so many issues at stake. The first one at the broader level, perhaps, is the challenge to the global liberal order. And this goes also back to your points about whether we see a new kind of war or not. Some call it hybrid warfare or information warfare. We definitely see the return of geopolitics in international relations. I think we've done with the optimism that was so characteristic of the end of the Cold War, and that consolidated the role of the United States as the hegemon in the international system. This has created, of course, also insecurities in some ways, we can see what's happening in Ukraine also as a part of Russia's insecurity, right? disinformation campaigns, the challenge perhaps of this liberal order, which was also related to challenges within this liberal order. I have here in mind, of course, Trump, Brexit. We see what happens now even in Europe with Lithuania. So that's the broader picture. But I think the key dimension there, and that's the new element there, is a return of geopolitics and great power competition. And of course, this affects Greece in many, many ways.
Thank you, Dimitris. I'm turning to Mr. Apostolos Tzitzikos to ask you what's your view on the matter, and how do you think, if things go wrong, what do you think will be the most immediate practical impact on Greece?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for your invitation to be with you today at LSE. It's a great honor and a pleasure. First of all, let me say that I would share the idea that the crisis today in Ukraine is an unfolding crisis. We will certainly see some involvements happening in the next couple of days or weeks. But I also share the idea that it will not be a large-scale invasion on behalf of Russia. And what I would think now is needed in two fronts internationally is first for the West not to lose its temperament, its calm, but should not lose also its decisiveness, meaning that we should not lose track of what the idea here is, that we cannot allow an international bully do as they want in an area of the world, which affects directly Europe, which affects directly the economies of the European countries and the West, energy, which are going to be the first that are going to get the blow, if you want, from such a crisis. However, Greece today needs to be right on track with the rest of the Western countries, and it did already. It already has done what is appropriate in this direction. However, allow me to say that in this very difficult situation, we are seeing another major issue when it comes to international politics that we need to deal with, and this is how Europe, the European Union, stands towards such crisis. And we've seen the European Union, whether it was crisis of immigration crisis, the health crisis, now with Ukraine, unfortunately is not reacting in a way that would make us Europeans feel secure, in a sense that we do not have a common policy. We do not react quickly, and we do not react the way we should, if you ask me, in many of these crises. The European Union needs today, more than ever, to become a political union. It needs today to have a common foreign policy. I know it is difficult. I know that state capitals need to interact when we have a crisis to find out the ways we need to react, but all this takes time, and we do not have time in international politics. We need to act fast and swift. So, in my opinion, for one more time, we see that there is a need, a great need, for a discussion in the European Union to see how we will react and how we will deal with such crises in a united front. However, Greece, and I close with this, my initial remarks and answer to your question, I think should be ready to face some great issues in the energy sector, which could create issues in society, which could then create also political issues. So we need to be ready. We need to be ready with a specific plan towards tackling the side effects or the direct effects, if you want, of the crisis in Ukraine.
Thank you very much. Just a remark based on what I've heard from this first round of responses. The point that you just made about how Europe is never prepared to deal with crisis, I will reverse the point. If there is one thing that I've learned about the European Union, it's that the only way in which it grows is through very dangerous and threatening crises. There's always a risk, but that's the only way for what is at the root of the problem, sovereign entities relinquishing part of their sovereignty, because this is, the conundrum for the European Union. For it to grow and develop in a more integrated way presupposes nation states to relinquish part of their sovereignty, which they never do on their own. They always need to be pushed by situations that appear to be unmanageable otherwise. So in a sense, this is both the risk and the hope of situations of that sort. Let me take it to the next step. And I'm going to stay with Mr. Tzitzikostas. You mentioned the potential risks on the economy that this crisis is generating. You are associated with a political party that has been in government since the summer of 2019, and it's been a steady succession of crises, mostly of international crises, the biggest of which has been the pandemic. It looks like the pandemic now might be perhaps ending. We can never say for sure, and we've been here a couple of times before. But how do you think a government in this day and age can manage, and of course you are yourself very much connected to the practical realities of regional governance, with crises of global significance, from the pandemic to climate change, which is associated with various natural disasters that have a very direct effect on how people think and of course how they behave politically. How do you as a politician manage the tension between the global crisis and the need for local responses?
Well, let me start by saying that the Greek government so far has reacted very successfully to severe cases and crises, from migration to border crisis to international issues with our neighbors, even to the pandemic. However, if you ask me, I believe that today the restart of Europe and the restart of the Greek economy is at stake, especially after the pandemic. So we have a great opportunity in front of us. Greece's 30.5 billion recovery and resilience plan was amongst the first plans adopted in Europe. And in addition to that, almost 40 billion euros will be allocated to Greece during the new programming period, 21-27. This is a sum of more than 70 billion euro, as you understand. It can be Greece's new Marshall Plan. It is the road, if you want to link it to your event today, towards better things. This is the way to meet the real needs of the economy and of the people under these very difficult circumstances globally. But to meet today's fundamental challenges, such as climate emergency that you said, digital transformation, resilience, inequality, global competitiveness, we need to be able to use and absorb this money for the real needs of the citizens and of societies. And of course, no one, no matter how large or powerful he is, can defeat such challenges alone. So of course, Greece cannot defeat them alone. Spain or Poland cannot succeed alone. Germany or France cannot face these challenges alone either. And we cannot solve the challenges of our time unless we solve them together. Unless we strengthen, as I said earlier, the European Union. And I agree with you that it is a lesson to be learned each time that we have a crisis. But we need to understand today how different stories, however they are different for each and every one of us, we still hold common hopes and common values. And you know, we may not come from the same place, but we all want to move forwards the same direction, towards a better future. So think about the climate emergency for a moment here. The science is unambiguous. Climate change is happening. It is human-made, and we must act now. Not only every government, but also every level of government must recognize that only together, with a partnership based on mutual trust, we can overcome this crisis. And of course, this is where, if you ask me, in order to answer your question, come the real role and the added value of regional and local authorities. The fact that we have the proximity with the citizens, their real issues, the real problems. We are the actors across Europe who can bring Europe closer to its citizens and answer to the real needs. And therefore, all these 70 billion euros, who, as I told you, could be a new Marshall Plan for Greece. need to be holding the regions and cities as counterparts in order to make sure that these funds will be allocated for the real needs of citizens and to respond to the real crisis that they face. So, in my opinion, and I close with this, the Greek government has done fantastic work when it comes especially to dealing with crises. However, now the key here is how we will make it possible to get out of this 10-year economic crisis in Greece, 3-year health crisis with the pandemic, 5-year crisis with the political system before. So we are now in the right track, but we need to make the step forward. I am very confident that this government can do this. However, we need always to remember that the government, however strong it is and determined to make the transition, it needs regions and cities right next to it in order to make sure that this recovery will happen swiftly, quickly, and answering to the real needs of people.
Thank you very much. I'm going to move to Mariana and follow up with a similar type of question, which is, I take Mr. Troikos' very optimistic take on how politicians need to assemble resources in order to meet the needs of the citizens. But my question is the following one, perhaps to sort of bring us closer to the ground, which is, given the fact that the situation of crisis that we're facing appear to be more and more difficult, it seems to me, one could argue that no matter the good intentions of various stakeholders, it's going to be increasingly challenging to meet the expectations of citizens, which are also growing. So on the one hand, people expect for every natural disaster to have an immediate response. They expect for any economic problem to have a policy package that addresses their needs. They expect less disruption in a situation in which it seems the rate of disruption is increasing, perhaps even exponentially. So how are we going to bridge these two diverging dynamics, especially in a context of democracy, which will lead me to my next point, to Dimitris. But Mariana, what do you think about it? Is it bridgeable?
So I think it's an excellent question, and it's obviously the one that we need to answer if we're going to move forward in a positive way and be in a position to take advantage of all of these positive changes that we're seeing as well. I think at its core, there's this sweet spot between a government that is very, very strong and able to respond to crises very, very quickly, swiftly, in an agile manner. And the fact that, you have populism in many, many countries, which could lead to difficult leaders, to challenging leaders taking power. So, you have these two elements. On the one hand, you want governments that are able to move very quickly. On the other hand, you have all of this disappointment that often leads to leaders that are perhaps dangerous in a position of extreme power. So I think that we saw that in the US. We're seeing that in many, many countries. You need to have this, I think there's this need for this discourse. We need to decide what kind of democracy we want, because democracies are by default, move like a pendulum. You don't have the same type of leader again and again. And I'm bringing this back to the situation in Greece. I think that what's been going on over the past 2-3 years is very, very positive. And we see a government that is able to rise up to the challenges, the consecutive challenges that have come up. But that's not necessarily going to remain true for, in perpetuity. That's the element of that's the way democracies work. So, you need these checks and balances that are going to be able to keep us on this track of progress. At the same time, we have a world in which crises are becoming bigger and bigger, and it's a lot more difficult to deal with them unless you have that flexibility. Now, think about the pandemic, for example. Being able to move quickly and being able to take certain very, very unpopular decisions, perhaps, was crucial in protecting people's lives in this particular instance. So the more checks and balances you have, the more difficult it is to move because you need these institutional checks, the more in trouble you might be when you face a very, very big crisis of the proportion of the pandemic, but also like climate change. So the one point that I'd like to make is that we need to talk about where that sweet spot is and how we can, sort of get the best of both worlds, have that stability that is so necessary, especially when you have these populist threats, and at the same time be in a position to move quickly and to react quickly to these crises. And coming back to what Mr. Tzikostas said about Europe and how important it is to use Europe as a solution to all of these issues. Obviously, these challenges that we're facing are so big that it's very, very difficult for individual countries of the magnitude of all individual European countries to deal with. That is something that I think we're a realization that we're coming to relatively late. We've been obviously on a track to more union, to a more unified Europe, but there have been hiccups. I think that these recent crises have shown us again and again just how important that is. And I think Europe is learning in a way. The way it reacted to the pandemic crisis is very, very different to the way it reacted to the previous crisis, the European financial crisis. And I think the foreign affairs plane is a plane where we need more and more unity from the part of Europe, and perhaps this specific crisis will lead us to it. It is absolutely necessary, and I agree with what has been said so far, 100%.
Mariana, thank you very much, and I take your point about the importance of learning. We tend to forget about it very often, conversations about how individual countries face situations have a very static kind of outlook. But to go back to Dimitris and take the question of the pandemic and bring China into the fold, and what you mentioned before, the crisis of the liberal order, because these are topics that are very much linked. On the one hand, when the pandemic crisis began, it looked like China was in a very difficult spot. The pandemic began in China. It was the Wuhan virus at the time. It seemed China had a very difficult situation on its hands. And then as the pandemic progressed, the situation apparently reversed. The West became extremely disorganized, the United States especially, but also the UK were found in a very difficult situation. And China seemed to get a grip on the crisis by adopting a very hard policy, a very authoritarian policy. It seemed to signal this idea that authoritarianism was a better way for dealing with these kinds of challenges than democratic politics with all their anarchy, all their complications. Now we are, again, it seems at a turning point because of the Omicron transition. In a sense, we've seen the situation of zero COVID as being extremely difficult to be managed. We see that in Hong Kong. It's not clear how things are going to develop. It may be that the success of China before may turn out not to be sustainable. And so I want to ask you, what's your view on that? And how do you think, coming out of the pandemic, to the extent that we can have an opinion about the development of things, what is the state of that debate between the relative effectiveness of authoritarian versus democratic systems? Is the consensus changing or not?
Yeah, that's a great question, but also a difficult one. Obviously, we had this discussion. I think I'll just go a bit back to what we'll be talking about, the return of geopolitics. And I think this discussion has important implication for Greece as well, but is also linked very much to what has been said already, also in the context of global crisis. My main concern, I think, and the key issue at stake is whether today's great powers are becoming too inward-looking, preoccupied with their narrow interests, without assuming great power responsibilities and leadership roles, especially with regards to global challenges. And in many ways, we saw that in the context of the global pandemic. We're seeing that in the context of climate change. And given that we're talking about the future today, I think that we are taking for granted that there will be great powers, assuming their great power responsibilities and contributing to the management of global challenges. But perhaps we're entering in a new period when we won't have new we won't have great powers anymore. And this raises important issues with regards to global governance. That's the more pessimistic note. But I think that also this is related to the European Union. Just to highlight, that's more a sort of a question, given the role of the European Union, that's more for a question for me, is the prospect of a differentiated EU, given, again, going back to the issue of learning,
but Dimitri, you keep talking about
the EU has been. Yes.
I would like to push you more on China.
Yes.
It's also the area of your specialty, and it's also for most people, I would say, in Europe and the United States, China is always the other, and it remains relatively opaque. So how has the pandemic changed China, and what do you think? Do you think that China is coming out of this adventure strengthened as a regime and as a state, or not?
I think to answer this question shortly, I think there is not one China. We have to see China with multiple identities that lead to contradicting foreign policies. On the one hand, we have this idea of China entitled to be a great power. This is where the debate is right now. Then China is also a developing country. We see that this makes then the Chinese leadership quite reluctant to assume, going back to my point, great power responsibilities. Then there is, as you said, the civilizational dimension. China's engagement and struggle with the standard of civilization and modernity, the 100 years of humiliation. So there is this sense of anti-Westernism as well. This is, of course, fueled by this effort to construct China as the other. Then China is a communist state. We tend to forget that its foreign policy, it's always shaped by the Communist Party, right? And this also reflects efforts by the Chinese Communist Party to enhance its legitimacy. So something that looks for us as outsiders, that not as a rational foreign policy, it might make sense from the point of view of the Communist Party and their effort to enhance the legitimacy of the Communist Party. And I think we have to take this into consideration. There has been more optimism about China's situation in global politics, that's for sure, and how that played out in the pandemic. But on the other hand, I do believe that the Chinese leadership, it remains quite insecure, and we always have to keep that in mind when we try to make sense of foreign policies like the wolf warrior, for example, diplomacy, right? When we try to understand the role of China. Definitely there has been this shift to a more confident China, and the idea that China has arrived now as a great power and we have to play a more active role. But at the same time, as I said, we also see these contradictions embedded in the multiple identities of China. And again, that has been at play in the context of the pandemic.
Thank you. I'll keep the focus on China and return to Mr. Tzitzikostas to ask you the following question. A few years back, in the middle of the financial Eurozone crisis, there was a sense that China was going to be a bigger player in the Greek economy, especially with the purchase of the port of Piraeus, massive investment in Greek real estate by Chinese individuals, massive Chinese tourism in Greece. All of that seems to have gone away, partly as a result of the pandemic, but there seems to be a change in the landscape. What do you think about that? Do you think that China is poised to be present in the Greek economy and in Greece more generally, or not? Do you think there's been a shift?
No, I think there's been a clear shift here. I indeed saw in the past years great interest on behalf of China to come to Greece, invest. We also had in our region, in northern Greece, in central, in Thessaloniki more specifically, interest on behalf of China to invest here. But however, I see that they have stopped, of course, because of the pandemic as well. But I think there's a shift of interest at this point on behalf of China. I don't see any real will for China to invest and incorporate the Greek economic system. However, I would say, and maybe it's a question also for Mr. Troikos, how should we be and how much should we be alerted with the relation of Russia with China that lately we have seen has been elevated to another level? Is it something that we need as West to be looking carefully at?
Well, I return to Dimitris on that question. Again, wearing my international relations hat, I would say that the traditional view has always been a view, at least in the realist school, of balancing. The United States is powerful, therefore China and Russia would balance the United States by sort of working together. On top of it, it helps that there are authoritarian regimes. At the same time, however, Russia is incredibly exposed to China. Siberia is a sparsely populated region of enormous economic potential, whose makeup may change due to climate change, sitting next to a very highly populated, much more aggressive, much more economically developing country, which is China. So if I were Russian, I would worry much more about China than about Europe and the United States, which creates the contradiction that we see today, in which there is a clash between Russia and the West, when in fact it seems the divide between Russia and China is much bigger. Is that the correct assessment, would you say, or not, Dimitri?
I think, Professor Kalyvas, that you're right. I would see Russia-China relations as part of an axis of convenience, and this can change very rapidly. I think that the Russians feel quite insecure about China's rise, as you mentioned, in Siberia. Those are key challenges for their bilateral relationship. And of course, it all depends also on how the other great powers, going back to my point about the role of great power management, can ensure that this management also involves China and Russia. It takes into consideration their interests, but at the same time, it's also about those two great powers assuming great power responsibilities. So maybe this seems as a very important development right now, but I don't think that it is sustainable in the future, since again, we talk about the future, but much will depend also on how the United States, the European Union, India, for example, will also try to play a larger role in shaping their future trajectory. About Greece and China relations, I think there was perhaps, again, the issue of learning. And I think it took Greece some time to learn also what the Chinese want in Greece. I think there was this idea that the Chinese were also interested in a more politics-oriented bilateral relationship. And now I think the Greek government tries to highlight that it should be still an economics-driven relationship. But I think this is a debate that we should have right now. That is, how we can reconcile how to confront essentially the dilemma of how to balance the much needed economic partnership with Beijing, especially in light of the long-lasting economic impact of the pandemic, without jeopardizing Greece's relations with its traditional allies, such as Greece. So I think that this pressure will become more acute, if you like, in the next years for Greece.
When I think about the Chinese influence in Greece or Chinese interest in Greece, one of the things that I have in mind in the last 10 years was this incredible urge that Chinese people had to get married in Greece, especially in the island of Santorini. So there is a dimension which is, escapes narrow economics, which has to do with what we would call soft power. That is the cultural power that perhaps a country as small as Greece can exercise on a giant country such as China. And the Chinese are very much aware of Greek antiquity. And that is an element that gives Greece an advantage that other countries of its size and perhaps even bigger size do not have. But I want to, yes.
If I may add something
yes,
here.
Absolutely.
It is true, and we need to realize that it is in the interest of Greece to have good relations with China, good relations with Russia, with everyone. We have and we can win from all these relations. They could be strategic partners, they could have a strong and close collaboration with Greece in the economic sector, but we should never forget our roots. We should never forget that our traditional allies are the ones that we need to work with closely and politically and geostrategically. So yes, culturally with China we share a lot of common things. My visits in China always Chinese officials underline the cultural ties that we have. We have the oldest cultural heritage in the world. These two countries, these two civilizations, if you want. With Russia, we have great collaboration with exports. So we need to work together. That's out of the discussion, of course. But never forget that our side and our coalition and our political strength and geostrategical aspect is with the West and with our traditional allies. So when it comes to an economic collaboration with these countries and with these partners, we say yes, but politically is another discussion.
Can I add something to that, because it's a very intriguing phrase that you use, because obviously the economic and the political are very intertwined. So perhaps it's not as easy to pick and choose which parts of an allyship we can or partnership we can build on and which ones we can ignore. And in particular, when we're talking about China and when we're talking about Russia, there are obviously, there's a cultural background that we do share and an ancient history in some cases, but there are things today that are very, very difficult to ignore about, for example, the human rights violations in both of these countries, which are not very convenient sometimes to bring up, but they're also in many ways indicative of the ways of how these leaders will interact with us if they're forced to. So, I think that we need to talk more about how we can re-engage, for example, the US, which seems to be pulling away from Europe from this entire area in recent years, and that's a very, very big difference. I think that's a very, very difficult situation that countries like Greece can find themselves in if the US really decides to just have this inward-looking, US-centric view of everything. I think that's one thing that we should probably discuss a bit more. And another note that I made had to do with self-sufficiency. And I think this crisis, the pandemic crisis, showed that there are certain, in this very, very globalized world, there are certain things that we really do need to have in our individual countries. Energy is a very, very big element in this discussion, and we're living through this inflation crisis right now, which we need to talk about as well. And it's imported. It's not something that has to do necessarily with what's been going on in the country, which shows A, how interconnected we are, but also B, that we have to be able to rely for certain core elements of our policy on our own resources, and that's also something that's changing. I don't think we thought this would be the case, 10 years ago. We took certain things for granted. So that's just two comments on the things that were discussed so far.
Well, it's a very relevant comment. In a sense, Greece's fortune from the very beginning of its independence have been very much associated with fortunes of Western Europe. The difficult thing for Greece was to tie itself with the West, because that was not obvious. No matter what we think about classical antiquity, it was always a very difficult step, a step fraught with obstacles, and we've experienced in our lifetimes just 10 years ago how tenuous that could be. But the broader question, of course, is that Greece will be doing well as long as Europe does well. It's very difficult to imagine a scenario in which Greece does well if Europe does not. And so that explains why we have this kind of global conversation right now, even though we have to focus on Greek things as well. We cannot answer that question, obviously. There are too many dimensions that are unknown, but certainly the challenges are very clear, as are the opportunities. I'll return to Mr. Tzitsikostas as well, and I want to focus on your home city, Thessaloniki. There are two images that I have in mind about Thessaloniki. On the one hand, it's a city of incredible potential. It's a city that has a very, very pronounced cultural capital, both vis-a-vis the Balkans. Whenever I travel in Balkan countries, people in places like Serbia, Romania are always attracted by Thessaloniki, its vibrancy, the presence of the sea. Even in the Eastern Mediterranean, in Turkey, Israel, etc., there's a very strong pull that Thessaloniki exercises. And on the other hand, we have a feeling that this potential never gets realized enough. We've experienced the sad developments with the recent, the sort of hooligan type activities in the city. There is a sense that the economy of the city is not where it should be, that there's not enough investment. How can we, again, reconcile those two views? How do you think that the future of Central Macedonia, which is the region you govern, which is very much a function of the health of the city of Thessaloniki, how do you see the potential developing in the future? Because that's a question also to ask about the country itself. If Thessaloniki does well in the future, it probably means that Greece will be doing well as well. If not, probably the opposite. So how do you see it from the perspective of where you're sitting?
Indeed, well, Mr. Kalyvas, I will tell you that in my view, there's only one image of Thessaloniki, the image of a multicultural city of great comparative advantages comparing to the rest of Greece, being geostrategically located. However, it is true that we have lost a lot of time here in northern Greece, meaning that so far we did not have the infrastructure in order to be able to have the role, to attain the role that you were describing, and that all of the southeastern European peninsula is waiting for Thessaloniki and northern Greece to have. We did not have the infrastructure. Today, Thessaloniki and Central Macedonia is a totally different city and region. We have a new international airport, which we did not have a couple of years ago. We have a port that is being developed, which was not developed in the years before. We have infrastructure in roads that connect not only Thessaloniki and Central Macedonia to all other Greek areas, but also to the countries in our north. We have all these major institutions in our city and our area that are promoting this notion and this role that we can play in the near future, meaning 5 great universities, 150,000 students at any time in our area with new brains, people who are ready to offer and support this model. We have all these innovative hubs and these research institutes in our city. We have the common, very, very strong Thessaloniki International Fair that is an extroverted, if you want, institution, the institution with the most extroversion in our city, which we are developing also, and we are changing it and renovating it and upgrading it in order to be competitive to other major institutes and organizations around Southeast Europe. And we are creating all these infrastructure that will allow us to play this role that we have been waiting for many years now. And it is true that we are probably the only European Mediterranean country where the North is not leading in development. This is about to change. And I will give you some very good examples. First of all, at this point, we have great companies that are investing in our region. Deloitte, Cisco, Pfizer have already invested and have created hubs in our city, Thessaloniki. And at the same time, I am in a position to know that discussions that have been undergoing in the past weeks are now ending, and we will be able to announce in a couple of weeks from now 2 major investments in our city as well. We also have again, with hundreds of new positions for young, highly skilled individuals. We have a great investment in the audiovisual industry. We have, you know, a lot of great big productions that are happening in our area, which are promoting, of course, our city and our region, but also creating a lot of seats and positions for working. And of course, another thing that we have managed to do these years is that we have created a very close collaboration with CERN in Geneva. And I'm in a position also to tell you that we are now trying to have an infrastructure of CERN in Thessaloniki. And actually, in 3 weeks from today, I will receive some people from CERN here to discuss this matter, and hopefully we will be able to make some announcements. So as you understand, Thessaloniki, Central Macedonia, which so far had its pillars, very strong pillar of agriculture. We are holding the 25% of the GDP in the agricultural sector in Greece. We are number one in the exports of agricultural products in Greece. 70% of the transportation of Greece is happening in our area. We are number one as a region touristically, because the last 3 years we have managed to have the most tourists of every other region in Greece, even more than the Attica region and the Aegean regions. And so to these two pillars, agriculture and tourism, we now have a new pillar, which is going to be the innovation and the new technology sector. So I really believe that combining all these sectors with all these infrastructures that we have finally in our area, we can see Thessaloniki, Central Macedonia becoming a protagonist in the next very few years. And believe me when I say that those investors who do not invest today in Thessaloniki and Central Macedonia will regret it very, very soon. Closing my statement and answering to your question, I would say that this is what Thessaloniki and Central Macedonia is about. It is a city and a region very open, very extroverted, very multicultural, and of course, events such the event that you mentioned, which was a tragedy, which was a horrible situation that we had to deal with, is unfortunately something that we see all over Greece, and not only Greece, but other countries as well. You know that radical voices and people who are using athletics in order to hide their most horrible emotions is something that needs to be dealt, of course, with our justice system, which is working very well, with our policing, and it is not something that represents Thessaloniki today or Greece today. It is exemptions to the rule, if I may say.
Thank you very much. I'll take one point of what you said about innovation and investment, and I'd like to link it to education. Dimitris is part of, like myself, of the education sector. Mariana is following what is going on very closely. So I want to ask both of you, what's the future of education in Greece? One would expect, for example, Thessaloniki not only to attract Greek students, the Greek universities in Thessaloniki and everywhere else should be attracting students from across the region. There is no reason not to do that. And even though we've seen some changes there, it seems everything is moving very slowly. What's your view? Dimitris first, Mariana then.
Well, first of all, I have to say that I was born and raised in Thessaloniki, and I was educated at the Aristotle University and at the University of Macedonia. And I'm grateful for the education that I received. I think that the Greek universities are doing a great job, and we shouldn't take that for granted. I know, of course, that things have been affected by the crisis and the broader impact on the society. Going back to what Mr. Gigikostas was saying, Thessaloniki has a lot of potential. Obviously, it needs also a push from Athens, and we see that this is changing in recent years, but the potential is definitely there. The other issue, of course, is the brain drain and how Greece can maintain the most dynamic young people, keep them in Greece and in Thessaloniki, of course, or perhaps always, you know, the Greek diaspora to give initiatives for people to go back. There is a lot of potential. I would just bring to this discussion the idea of science diplomacy, since Mr. Troikos mentioned CERN, for example. This is another potential that has been tapped, I think, by Greece. How you can mobilize the brilliant engineers, academics, practitioners in the context of science diplomacy, for example. There is, of course, a lot to be done. We need reforms in the educational system, but I'm not into this more, let's say, miserable side that complains about the Greek education system all the time. Excuse me. I've been lucky enough to be educated in the Greek system, and there is a lot of potential and a lot of work is been doing. But what we need perhaps is a more inward-looking now educational system.
Thank you. Mariana?
So obviously I don't share the view that Greeks are not well educated. I think we have a good system. We need to find ways to making it better and more relevant to what's necessary today. And I think skills are at the core of that. I think we need to teach our kids better skills and more to have a very specific skill set rather than a specific knowledge set. And I think we see some initiatives in that direction, and that's very, very positive. But I don't think we're moving fast enough in this direction. But of course, this is not a problem just for Greece. It's something that's going on all over the world as the needs of the labor market change. Most countries have not been super quick at reacting. I think technology can play a huge role in that. And you know, we got a first glimpse of things that we once thought were unimaginable during the pandemic. I have two young children, and the idea initially that they would be that they would be getting lessons over the internet was absurd in my mind. But we saw that even though there were tremendous drawbacks, it's still something that can partially be done. And the technology is there. We just need to find ways of getting the best of it, and also keeping this human element in, which is so important. Another point that I'd like to make regarding education is this need for people who have range. I think that the tendency in the recent past was to really specialize in very small packets of knowledge, and I think that was great for the previous decades. It's going to be less and less relevant in an AI-enabled world, in a world where you can get answers to specific questions very quickly. What you need is people who have this ability to think, to focus, but also be able to see, the forest and not just the tree. And that applies not just to, economics or the academic world. I think it applies to many specific professions within our economy. And that's something that, from my experience at least, is still lacking somewhat in Greece. And we need to do a better job at encouraging our youth to explore that, to have that range that was not so important before, but is going to be very important now. And I think a final point has to do with this outward approach. I think we need to connect Greeks to what is going on abroad. Universities need to do a better job at that, but also we need to tap into our diaspora. There's all this talk about bringing Greeks who left back, and it's great, and we hope to get some of that fresh blood back in, because with their knowledge, their know-how, their experience, they can really strengthen our economy. At the same time, there are people who are going to stay right where they are, doing incredible things, like some of our panelists today. And you want to have that exchange. You want to be able to use that brain power, use these experiences without them necessarily moving back to Greece. They might not want to. And I think we need to create better channels at taking advantage of all of this incredible, human capital that exists abroad. And it's not just Greeks abroad; it's also anyone who might be interested in giving to this country.
Okay, let me add. Yes, please.
I just wanted to totally agree with Ms. Kyriakaki. We need to use, in a good sense, these people, the Greeks that are abroad working. However, from the 500,000 Greeks who left in the last couple of years during the crisis, basically, Greece to go in other countries, most of them really want to come back. But in order to come back, in order to move from brain drain to brain gain, as we call it, we need to create the infrastructure and the businesses that would serve their abilities. This was one of the problems that Greece had in the past years, mainly because of the financial crisis and because we had governments who did not believe in this kind of developments, new technologies, innovation. Today we have a government that is totally pro-business, totally pro-innovation, totally pro-new technology. And we open our gateways, we help them with bureaucracy, we have made all the reforms in our governments and our regions in order to be able to help these investors. Because by bringing these investors and these businesses on new technologies and innovation, by creating a climate that is friendly and that supports these kinds of businesses, because we have, as I told you earlier, all the competitive advantages, then we will be able to create thousands of working places for high-skilled young generation people who left Greece and want to return. And this is what we're doing today in Central Macedonia, this is what we're doing in Thessaloniki, but this is what we're doing in Greece in general. Greece is changing. And I'm really happy to be part of this great effort to change and reform Greece. A reform that should not stop, of course. We need several things that need to happen, and in education. And we need to finally be able to link education to the working environment and the real economy, which is something that the ministries of education and the ministries of economy are working a lot. And I think that funds from the 70 billion funds that I told you earlier from the RRF and the new programming period are going to be allocated in order to create this link between education and real economy.
Thank you. There is actually, I'm following also the questions that people are asking. There's a question, for example, about how the need for a skills-oriented education that is broad enough, whether that can be achieved in the short term. My sort of understanding is that it's not easy to achieve this type of changes in the short term. They require a general re-engineering of how we think about education, which is difficult to achieve quickly. I would also say that very often a lot of these problems are not problems that are connected to financing. There are problems connected with ideas. There is always a tendency to throw more money to old ways of doing things. That's our natural kind of tendency, rather than think creatively about new ways of doing things. Usually the response one gets is that these things cannot be done when one proposes new ways. But I want to connect the beginning of our conversation with the last points that were just made. I take the point about Greece becoming more open for business. I would also stress the need to attract people who are not necessarily Greeks, who are just highly skilled individuals who would like to live in Greece and can offer their skills to Greece. And also we have to come up with a cultural understanding of Greece that allows these people to become part of what we are. These are, I think, very interesting challenges and worth taking. But at the same time, one of the things that we've noticed in other countries, including the UK, for example, is that there is an increasing gap between people who have high skills, people who are cosmopolitan, who are able to move between different countries and different cultures, people who tend to, in a sense, move on in life and move up. And then people who feel stuck, people who feel they're losing, who cannot really acquire the skills to compete successfully, who feel that the country they live in is not the same as what they were used to, who feel out of place, and as a result sometimes mobilize, especially they're perhaps taken into advantage by politicians who feed their sense of loss. And you can tell the fundamental story of populism in the United States, the UK, and other places by just emphasizing this divide between the cosmopolitan sort of capital city-oriented people and the younger also people and older people left behind. So how do you see these two kinds of trends playing out in Greece? Mariana, perhaps first.
I think it's a very good question, and sometimes when we have these discussions, I get the sense that we sometimes fall into that trap as well. We have this idea that what people care about is super high tech jobs, when in reality the problems that they face on the ground are very, very specific and very, very different, and far from that. And of course, in an economy, everything plays its part. So you want all of this, for example, high-tech growth and high-tech jobs to fuel other parts of the economy. So I'm not discounting it at all, but there are still structural issues that we need to deal with that affect people's lives on a daily basis. As you said, these are things that can be taken advantage of. These are sentiments that are ripe for being abused by shrewd leaders that might decide to use them as ammunition in an election. But there are things you need to do. I think the RRF, for example, which is an incredible opportunity for Greece, and this opportunity of having this funding would not be here necessarily if we hadn't had the pandemic. So it's one of the few good things that have come out of it. It's not a given at all that we're going to be able to absorb this money and make sure that it goes to the places where it needs to go. I think that's the big challenge of the next 4 or 5 years for Greece, to make sure that this money goes where it's going to have the biggest impact, and the biggest impact in terms of growth. That's what you need. Investments that really fuel growth. I think what we're missing right now is this combination. We have talked about technology, we have talked about agriculture, we have talked about tourism. A lot of the progress that we expect to see is from where these different sectors interact. And that's something that's not very easy to grasp. For example, with the RRF, you want people to come up with business plans that have a digital element, that have a green element, that try and bring different sectors together. That's not something that's super easy for a regular Greek businessman, and most businesses in Greece, as we know, are small and very small businesses, to grasp, to come up with, and to use at the end of the day. So
let me just make a point here, because I think you raise a very interesting issue. If I were to think of an average student in the US or in the UK, and I told them that these two words, a business plan, they immediately understand what it is. If I tell a Greek student in Greece that term, business plan, most students do not know what a business plan is as a concept, not even as a way to think about. So that's a deficiency of the educational system, that students are not prepared to the sort of environments that modern economies necessitate. So how do we address that?
That's the $1 million question, isn't it? I mean, there are lots of approaches. For example, I'd like to point out to I don't know if you're aware of the Khan Academy approach to things. Salman Khan is this US. I'm not sure I would say technologist, educator, something in between, who's saying what you were saying, Professor, earlier. We need to re-engineer the entire educational system. We need to, have lectures take place online and have seminars take place in person with teachers that are a lot more engaged in what every individual student is learning. We need to bring the economy into the market into class very early. We need to hone people's financial skills, for example. That's a huge area that is so overlooked in Greece. We recently did a report on this. The financial literacy in Greece is incredibly low for both men and women. And we're talking about basics, as you said. A business plan is not something super advanced, and it's not something that is very difficult for people to grasp if you spend the time and if you invest the resources to really get that message across. So I think we need to go back to the basics, and that's where the skill sets need to be built. People can then, thanks to the internet, once they have that foundation, go and find resources that were never available before. And that's something that we really need to take advantage of. So that's where I would start, I guess.
Dimitri, any thoughts?
Yeah, that's a difficult question. I totally agree with what Mariana said, and I think the issue of the financial literacy is a very important issue, and how we learn from an early age to think in specific terms. That's one thing. There are some concerns, of course, the digital divide. Of course, there's so many opportunities, right? We have now the European Union's green and digital New Deal. And I think, again, there are many opportunities there to be tapped. I'm also concerned, but we shouldn't forget the impact of the economic crisis in Greece. And I think now we are in a period where we're moving out of these, but it would still take a lot of effort, perhaps a lot of good coordination. And I'm not referring only here to the government, local communities, the role of the civil society. There are many issues of how to make young, talented people motivated, for example. So you don't leave them behind. I still have in mind, as you mentioned, Professor Kalyvas, what happened in Thessaloniki with Alkis. I'm concerned also about the radicalization of young society. That's something new, I think. As Mr. Troikos said, this happens all over the world, but I think it's a new phenomenon in Greece. I don't have answers for that, or the demise of the middle class, for example. Another challenge will be how to tackle the public debt, especially in the context of the global pandemic. And I think all of those issues are intertwined, and education is the most important issue.
If you allow me, Mr. Kalyvas, there's one more thing. I totally agree with Ms. Kenakakis and Mr. Troikos, of course, but there's one more thing that Greece needs to do, and we are very late about it. It has to do with the change of our constitution that will allow private universities to come in Greece and elevate, in a way, the educational system. Because, you know, it is not only a financial matter here, meaning that many students could stay in Greece instead of going outside of Greece to study, maybe having LSE being in Greece, or Georgetown, my university, being in Greece. It's not only the financial aspect of it, but it's also a fact, in my opinion, that by bringing private universities and schools we have, but I mean university level, in Greece, we will be able to elevate also our public universities, because there will be a change of know-hows, there will be a competitiveness, if you want, in a good sense, that would elevate all of the educational system. So this is something that Greece does not have. I think we are one of the very few, if not the only one European country that does not have this this change in their constitution in order to be able to have private universities. And this, in my opinion, needs to change yesterday.
In fact, I mean, there are things that can be changed more immediately. There are a few institutions that operate outside the public system. I will mention in northern Greece, ACT, and also the American Farm School, which are institutions that have tremendously promising infrastructure and certainly the right culture and norms to expand, but have been restricted by a variety of legal kinds of regulations and restrictions that never allowed them to reach their full potential.
Exactly.
So we already have the ability to do better, and they're extremely well staffed. I often come to contact with students from those places, and to say a good thing about Thessaloniki, the best students I've had at Yale were students from Anatolia College, by the way. Incredible.
We are very proud of it, by the way.
So there is, the potential is there, but I have a sense, I remember participating in a conference in the 1990s at Harvard, where the the main topic was the gap, the Greek paradox, it was called, the gap between potential and reality. And here we are, 30 years later, discussing exactly the same question with an enormous crisis on our backs. So how can we translate, I mean, we would all agree, and I'm sure that even we had more people on the panel, and I see some of the questions as well, we would all agree that the diagnosis can be quite common in terms of the potential of Greece, the challenges it faces. But then when it comes to the actual implementation of measures that would allow us to break some of those roadblocks, this is where I think problems begin. And I know that we're not going to have any, concrete answer in this panel, because there are so many factors that enter into this process. But my feeling was, at least in 2019, before the pandemic crisis began, that finally we were on the cusp of getting away from the difficulties of the crisis and charting a new way. Then the pandemic hit. Now we have a new world economy that's characterized by high inflation, which is going to create, of course, new problems. We have a situation in which the potential rise in interest rates may make our debts, more difficult to sustain. So it seems like it's one challenge after the other. So is Greece going to overcome those challenges to be able to really get started, get its new start, so to speak, or not? If I were to ask you for a percentage, what's the proportion, what's the probability you give for one or the other option? What would be your answer?
I think we don't have a choice, if you ask me. I think this is a make it or break it moment for the country. The stars have aligned somehow, despite the very, very tragic losses that came with this crisis and the fact that we've been through an unnecessarily long crisis before that. I think at this point, there are certain elements in place that give us the opportunity to really make that leap. And right now, we're not as far behind as we would be 10 years later, because we were talking about these exponential technological changes, and we're at the beginning of this. At least my understanding is that we're at the beginning of this incredible, brave new world of technological progress, and we really need to catch that train and make sure that we're not going to miss it. This is our opportunity for that. But to really do better, and I think that's a point that we haven't made as much, we need to do better for more people, for more groups of people. There are still many issues within society in Greece that we haven't dealt with. And because, again, we're talking about the intersection between the economy and politics, and these do not move in predictable ways. You might think you're doing very, very well on the economic front, and you could have a huge social issue brewing that could completely sidetrack your progress. I think it's important for us to think of specific groups that are more vulnerable, to think about long-lasting, inequalities that we need to address. For example, and we haven't mentioned it, but it's not just the only group. Women in our country are still underpaid. They still get, worse access to a lot of services. There are many, many issues we need to address as we're moving forward. And that's the only way to really achieve, the kind of growth that we want, in my opinion.
Let me take it from here and ask you more direct questions about politics. Where is politics in Greece right now? In the next couple of years, we have a new parliamentary election, so that introduces uncertainty, especially given the situation with the electoral system. Do you think that the political outlook for Greece might actually make things worse or not?
Should I? Sorry, yeah. Should? Oh, okay, sure. So I think that we're. My view, and obviously everybody has their own view on these issues, is that we have a 5, 6, 7 year period of stability ahead of us in terms of the political system. I think we have a horizon to do certain things. That's why I'm so optimistic. If we didn't, things would be a lot more problematic. I think we're on the right track. I think given the fact that we just went through this massive pandemic crisis, the current government has, is still popular. I think the opposition has not found its footing yet. And so, in my opinion, we do have the horizon to do these things in the next few years. But things could change. This is a very, very dynamic situation, and as we see, nobody expected we'd be talking about inflation after the pandemic crisis. We were all ready to talk about things getting better, and now we're also we have the looming Ukraine crisis as well. So it's very, very difficult to really predict. But I think, ceteris paribus, if nothing changes, we do have a good 5, 6, 7 year period ahead of us of relative stability that could allow us to do things.
Actually, I remember at the beginning of the pandemic, most people on the economic front were worried about deflation. With so many companies closing down lines of production, the market shrinking, there was a sense that we would go towards deflation. And the fear is that once you get there, it's very difficult to get out of it.
And it could still happen, by the way. It could still happen. I mean, the fundamental trends are there. You have technologies that are making, our productive capacities better and better. You have energy, which is going to get renewable energy, which is going to make energy cheaper. So the fundamentals are towards lower prices, not higher prices. And I think that's something that's important to bear in mind.
Dimitris?
I will strike a more pessimist note, not that I disagree with Mariana. We talked about the Ukraine crisis, we haven't talked about Turkey, and of course instability is always there. Turkey will remain the most perennial security threat.
Tell us a little bit about Turkey then.
Well, we know that there has been this assertive turn, especially after the failed coup, and for all of those participating today in this conference, hardly a day passes by without hearing about a new provocation. Things have become even more complicated now with the energy discoveries in the Eastern Mediterranean. For many years, tensions with Greece and Turkey, tensions with Turkey were confined to the Aegean. Now there is a new dimension there. In many ways, I think, as far as Greece's foreign policy is concerned, we should still continue to engage with Turkey, of course. But at the same time, some important steps have been made towards enhancing Greece's deterrent capabilities, what is known as internal balancing. There has been also some effort towards soft balancing, that is balancing Turkey by other than military means. We saw that in specific partnerships with new partners. I have here in mind the Egypt-Cyprus-Greece partnership, the Israel-Cyprus-Greece partnership, enhancing, strengthening military cooperation with France and of course the United States. It's going to be a very important challenge. But I'm sure that there are ways to navigate to that, but we have to be very creative. But we shouldn't forget that the external influence and the external environment very much intersects with domestic politics. And that's why perhaps I share this more pessimistic view, but we shouldn't forget how the external and the domestic are quite blurred in the era of globalization, because we still live in the era of globalization. I just wanted to throw that because we haven't mentioned Turkey yet in our discussion.
Thank you. Turkey, Mr. Tzitzikostas. Any thoughts?
Well, Turkey and generally, I would say that I am by nature optimistic. However, as a politician, I also need to be realistic. And to be honest with you, I feel that we have a clear and present danger today, which is called inflation crisis. And I'm afraid that, and I do not share the view that this inflation crisis will be for the next 1, 2, 3, 4 couple of months. I'm afraid that this crisis is a crisis that is here and will stay for a long time. The European Union and the West needs to deal with it. The situation might even deteriorate if the situation in Ukraine escalates in a bad way. So I'm afraid that this could bring, but as I said at the beginning, if you remember, in society, it could make the society react, and I would say we already start to see some signs. It will influence society, it will influence the economy, and it could also influence politics in Greece. We've seen that in the past. The fact that I'm afraid that this thing is not here for a very short while, but it's here to stay for a long while, it's something that needs to preoccupy us a lot, because we have seen political forces of populists in the past trying to take advantage of economic crisis and crisis of society to make their way up to government. So we need to be very careful. But again, as you said, and as I'm sure Professor Kalyvas would totally agree, history is not linear. The same way progress is not linear. There are economic cycles, there are pandemics, there are natural disasters, there are international conflicts, failing leaderships that have repeatedly disrupted and changed the course of history. And this will happen repeatedly in the future as well. So the most important and meaningful thing, in my opinion, is to learn from the lessons of the past in order to build a better future. And we cannot stand still, you know, and either celebrate the achievements or mourn the losses of the last decades and centuries. What we can and what we must do is to learn and to change. Have we failed as a country in the past? At times, absolutely. But the test is not perfection, you know. The real test is whether we are able to recognize these failings and then rise again to meet new challenges. The test, in other words, is whether we are shaped by events or whether we shape them, whether we leave things to change or whether we build the future. So if you ask me, Greece has gone through very tough challenges during the last decades. But if it wasn't only, you know, the magnitude of these challenges and the problems that brought us down, it was also other things such as the smallness of politics, the absence of vision, the lack of proactiveness that did not allow us to get back on our feet faster. So this is something that we cannot allow to happen again in our country. And I really feel that Greeks united and are able to overcome these obstacles, and we can make it again. So I share the optimistic view of Ms. Kyllakakis in saying that I believe that indeed we have some years ahead of us of great stability. However, we always need to keep in mind that things are not going to be easy, and we need to be ready to address these issues. And in a government perspective, we need to be ready to support the Greek society in these difficult times in order not to leave any gap to populists to try to take advantage of the situation. Now, when it comes to Turkey, and let me end with this comment, I will tell you that indeed, we have made a lot of progress in our country in the last 2 years, in getting Greece ready to have a proportional defense comparing to Turkey. And indeed, with the alliance that we have created with France and other countries of the West has brought us to a better position. Turkey realizes that. Of course, they don't like that. But this is how it is, and Turkey needs to realize that Greece is not just a neighboring country of Turkey. Greece is Europe. Greece is the European Union, and the borders of Greece are the borders of the European Union. So when Turkey is discussing on issues concerning Greek islands, they should know that they're discussing on European islands. And this is something that the European Union has also come to realize, especially after the migration crisis, that crises like this cannot be dealt as a crisis of 1 or 2 countries, but as a European crisis. So I really believe that today we are in a much better position. I know that there is great instability in Turkey. I know that the Erdogan regime is having great issues, and we might even have changes in the near future. However, Greece is in a better position with its allies, and we were here to respond to any kind of events might happen in the near future or the latter future on behalf of Turkey. And we always need to realize that this instability in Turkey could definitely create issues, not only militarily, but also by instrumentalizing the migration crisis. And Europe needs to be ready and to know that at any time, at any moment, Turkey could unleash again all these thousands of immigrants and refugees come to the Greek islands and to European territory. And therefore we need, and we are, I think, in a better position to address that issue as well. European and Greek.
Thank you very much. I have to say that one of the things that perhaps is I find quite striking is that perhaps starting with the last LSE conference, the student conference, which was the last pro-pandemic meeting in February 2020, I often joke that perhaps we all got infected and were asymptomatic in that conference because the room was packed. It was the first meeting at the time in which there was a cautious optimism about Greece. Prior to that, I would say every meeting, every conference I attended about Greece was very deeply pessimistic. So in retrospect, we can say that February 2020 marked some sort of turning point, and today we are at meetings such as this one, which is not the only one I've been in which there is a sense that Greece is moving ahead, something that was impossible to imagine just a few years back. So I think that's a very, very major achievement. And the fact that it becomes, especially in Europe, there is a sense that Greece has shaken off its bad image and has returned. That was not at all accepted just a couple of years back. So I want to underline the importance of that shift of attitudes, because it also is very important psychologically, and it also has a very, very definite, very direct effect on a variety of aspects of public policy and our relationships with other countries. So I think we've sort of charted a variety of different issues. There is agreement on the fact that there's incredible challenges ahead of us globally in the European continent, and also in our most immediate neighborhood. At the same time, there is a sense that things are happening and moving. And as Mariana pointed out, we have no choice. We have to actually implement the changes that move us ahead. I'll just turn to you and ask you for just a couple of minutes of final reflection before we close this panel on how you see things developing in the next year. Say, if we were to imagine ourselves meeting again in this welcoming venue, in person, hopefully, next year, where would you think today that things would stand for the country?
Would you like me to take it first, since it's difficult? I have to say, the predictions, making predictions is never a good spot to be in.
The famous Yogi Berra saying that forecasts are very difficult, especially when it comes about the future.
Yeah, absolutely, exactly. So if we were to forecast, for me, the big question is what's going to happen with inflation. I gave a slightly more positive, more optimistic prediction earlier. I'm not entirely sure where I stand on that, but that's a big.
We're talking about predictions. A year ago, nobody would have mentioned inflation.
It was not on anybody's radar in reality. So who knows what's going to be on our radar a year from now.
As I said, 2 years ago in February 2020, nobody thought there would be a pandemic.
Absolutely. So it's very, very dynamic. I think one first thing we're going to see is whether this crisis, this pandemic crisis, is leading to more Europe or less. I think that's one of the things that in the next year we're going to get a better sense of. Are we going to have a more cohesive EU foreign policy? Are we going to move forward a little bit more towards European level defense? That's another big issue that we didn't mention that much, but I think that's high on the agenda for Greece in particular. Another big thing that I'll be watching, not necessarily knowing what to expect, is what we do with climate change. We haven't talked about that as much, but it's going to be, it's an existential threat. We might do everything right on all of the things that we've been discussing today, and still be in very, very deep trouble in the next decade because of that. My sense is that we're not moving fast enough on that front. We're getting distracted by all of the different things that are going on, and we have this huge crisis moving closer and closer and closer, and we're not necessarily in a position right now to avert this disaster. So we want to see what's going to happen on that front in the next year. And finally, I think another thing for Greece that I'm very, very closely watching is once we resume, once we hopefully get back to normal, are we going to really take advantage of the lessons of the past 2 years, or are we going to go back to normal? Like, one big sector where I expect to see change is tourism. Yes, we were doing very well right before the pandemic hit, but there's this whole movement about how you travel and the kind of tourism services that you offer as a country. And I think it's in Greece's advantage to really take the lessons of the past 2 years and offer something else, something better, to really establish itself as a destination. I think that's a huge part of what we can achieve in the next few years.
Before I ask the other two panelists to comment on that, I'm alerted by the fact that, in fact, there are a few people, or perhaps more people, in the room at the Hong Kong Theatre at the LSE, and some of them may want to ask questions in person. I hadn't realized that there were people there. So I would say, before we close, let's try to see whether there are questions that we can take, a couple of questions for a couple of minutes. The Hong Kong Theatre, of course, is in London and not in Hong Kong. So can you hear me? And are there any questions from the room? I still don't
Yes, we can hear you. Give us a second to turn on the mic.
Hello, 1, 2. Can you hear me?
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you to the speakers and the moderator for your contributions to the discussion. My question relates to the Ukraine crisis. So usually the weapon or threat of the EU and the West against Russia is sanctions. But considering how high energy prices are right now and how dependent some EU nations, like Italy, for example, are on Russian gas and oil, is that threat still credible? And do we actually have any political leverage to prevent this crisis? Or are we going to just harm ourselves more? Thank you.
Thank you. Any other question? Let's group a couple of questions and so we can conclude, because we're going to run out of time. Any other question from Hong Kong?
Yes. So you've mentioned about the prospect of a more integrated Europe or of a common European foreign policy, but to what extent is that feasible if we do not see further fiscal integration in the Union? I mean, there's always the famous case of the United States becoming the United States because they created common debt. Could the fact that the EU has somewhat moved to that direction be the start of a more fiscal and integrative union that could also lead to a more unionized foreign policy?
Okay, thank you. Is there any
And
final?
one more?
Yes.
Hello. So some of us are students aspiring to enter the political arena. Would you have any advice on possible pathways one could follow to enter the political world in Greece?
Perhaps we should start with Mr. Nikos, and perhaps being the only one among us who are in the political arena, can give some advice to that student.
This is a very interesting question, because to be honest with you, Greek politics are very, let's say, interesting politics, in the sense that you never get bored, believe me. So I honestly understand that this question is something that a lot of people might have in mind. And this is something that I really believe that we need to address as a country as well, with laws. Meaning that we need finally to have laws answering to the question of the political money. We have not yet answered these questions with very specific and strict laws, which would allow basically the rules of the game to be equal for everyone. You know, politics cannot be something that only big families can take advantage of, or big political or economic families can take advantage of. Politics is not something that someone who is only rich and famous can do. Politics is something that anyone could be able to be involved. And this is why, for example, in my region, when I run for election because I'm a directly elected governor and we have elections every 4 and 5 years. What I do is I give the opportunity in my ballots to have people from all over the range of society and give them the opportunity to express themselves, to talk to the other citizens, and to have the opportunity to be elected and get elected and enter the political system. This is what political parties need to do. And they are doing it. Some of them are doing it more than others. But of course, in my opinion, we need to put a set of rules, specific rules that would make politics more attractive to young people and more open to everyone. I'm afraid that today in Greece, I've witnessed this myself, there are many walls, not only for young people, but also for young minds, because, you know, it's not being young in your ideas is more important than being young at your age. But what I'm trying to say is that we need to give opportunities. And in order to give opportunities, we need to make a set of changes in the rules of politics in Greece. So I really believe that political parties such as, for example, Nea Demokratia, is giving the opportunities to young people. If you see today in Greece, the government has several people who are not elected and never were elected in any position. They were taken from the society, people who have succeeded in their fields, and they are here in the government as technocrats helping out make a stronger country. And if you ask me, one of very successful ministers today in Greece, and there are few of them, are coming from the society, are not directly elected politicians. Of course, they could be directly elected in the next election, but this means that this government is giving the opportunity to young people to enter politics, and not in a direct way, in an indirect way. First to show their capabilities, and then to be able to present themselves into the public. So again, one is to have political parties that are open to people, like the lady who just asked the question. Second, set of rules that will allow everyone to be able to enter politics on an equal basis. And of course, the third is to realize that if the political system does not change itself, unfortunately, more and more people will be turning their backs in politics. And if you see many countries today, this is not the case in Greece, of course, thank God so far. But if you see other countries, we have very high percentages of people not going to the ballots, not going to vote on election day. This shows that democracy needs to be strengthened. And if we want to strengthen democracy, we need to give the opportunity to the people to get involved more.
Dimitri, any opinion about the three questions that people asked from the room?
Yeah, they were all great questions. I won't talk too much about Ukraine. Well, I will answer with another question. What happens when sanctions are your only option? That's something to consider. Of course, foreign policy is always very messy, and a key issue that is at stake is the role of misperceptions, miscalculations, the role of mistrust. So a lot of prudence is needed during this crisis and what will unfold in the next days, especially when nuclear weapons are involved, and we don't talk much about nuclear weapons. About the European Union, it's clearly one of the most fascinating projects, if you like, of the 20th century and of the 21st century. There's no doubt about that. And of course, Greece's place is within the European Union. The question is, again, how Europe's future will be shaped by this broader shift in the global distribution of capabilities, the return of geopolitics. There is some scope, as I mentioned earlier, about differentiated integration that might seem more feasible in the near future, at least, especially when it comes to common foreign policy and capabilities. But generally, going back to the key theme, and I know that I mentioned earlier that I'm a bit pessimist about Greece's international environment. On the other hand, and going back also to what Professor Kalyvas, you said that there is this change to more optimism. I think that, well, clearly Greece is a small state, but we are now in a position to also appreciate the role of agency. This is echoing, of course, what Mariana and Mr. Gigikostas have been saying, that Greeks can shape the future. And I think we have moved from this more miserable understanding of history and how a small state like Greece can have agency, be creative, also prudent, and make some difference for the better, whether this is foreign policy, whether this is domestic politics, whether this is the democracy as an institution in Greece, and so on. So I would like to end with a more optimistic note after all.
If I may take your remark just a step beyond, I would say, the point I made before, that Greece's fortune have been tied historically with Europe's fortunes. And if we look at Europe's fortunes in the last 10, 15 years, the two major shifts that we've observed in Europe was one, tighter financial integration with new institutions caused by the misfortunes and the bad choices of Greece. So in a sense, Greece's mistakes were a factor that led to a major redesign of financial institutions in Europe. And the pandemic, another general misfortune and crisis that led to the mutualization of debts and the opening of, in a sense, choices that were thought as unthinkable just a couple of years ago. So it may be that the crisis in the Ukraine, to go back to the question that was asked, opens up opportunities for collaborative foreign policy at a level that is above what we've observed so far, especially given the understanding that the United States is not as, tightly involved in European affairs. So my point here is that we should see crisis, the flip side of crisis, certainly when it comes to the European Union. It seems that this has been, and I would also add, the Brexit crisis also was a factor that increased the sense of cohesiveness within Europe, also increasing the level of pro-Europeanness in Britain, in spite of the decision it made. So there is always the flip side of things. I'm usually the one accused of being an optimistic, and I like to point these things out, but I was surrounded today by three other optimists. I want to thank you very much for a very, I hope, lively and interesting discussion. And with that, I think I can give the floor to the organizers in preparation of the next panel. I only hope to meet you in person in the near future. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And congratulations on your documentary TV series. They are amazing.
Thank you.